Welcome to Twists of Life, where every story has an unexpected turn. Stories of joy and sorrow, hope and redemption, just like the life we all live. Make yourself comfortable. It's time to begin. Eleanor stood still at the edge of a wide field overgrown with thick grass. A gentle breeze played, ruffling strands of her hair. High above, in the bottomless blue sky, the sun shone brightly. The girl's gaze was fixed on the distance, towards the horizon line. There, barely discernible, a tiny dot appeared. It rapidly grew larger, taking on the shape of a human figure. Eleanor knew who was approaching. She was waiting specifically for her, for it was only for this meeting that she was here. The dot grew, and now a running girl appeared before Eleanor. A smile lit up Eleanor's face. It was her. Long, light brown hair, ringing laughter in eyes the color of light caramel, a scattering of freckles, a slightly upturned nose, thin, graceful arms and legs. The girl strikingly resembled Eleanor, as if she were her exact reflection. Beside her, Eleanor felt an inexplicable sense of happiness and serenity. Their communication was wordless. They simply smiled at each other, intertwined their fingers, and laughed heartily. Sometimes they ran somewhere together. Sometimes they found a cozy boulder and sat contemplating the world around them. At times, they simply wandered through the surroundings. Eleanor understood perfectly well that these meetings took place in the realm of dreams. Her friend didn't appear every time, but quite often, especially in earlier years. Sometimes once a month, sometimes several times a week. Eleanor always anticipated these dreams. They were different from ordinary ones. They were too real, too vibrant, and they never faded from memory after waking up, as happened with other dreams. Eleanor couldn't remember when the girl first appeared in her life. It seemed this friend from dreams had been with her forever. At first, both were just tiny tots. They grew and changed synchronously, at the same time. Now they were both 14. No longer children, but not yet adults. Tall, thin, slightly awkward teenagers. Unfortunately, these dreams broke off suddenly and quickly, and now, a sharp sound tore Eleanor from the world of dreams. She found herself in her bedroom, on her bed. Her cat Whiskers was comfortably settled beside her. His clumsy jump onto the bedside table had caused a glass of pencils to fall. It was this clatter that had interrupted Eleanor's dream. Well, now there's no telling when to expect the next dream with my girlfriend, but definitely not today. Eleanor stroked the cat. He immediately turned on his tractor purr and settled more comfortably on the table. Now he would be her night guard. The girl smiled and turned onto her other side. She needed to fall asleep quickly. She had to get up early tomorrow. The holidays were over. Eleanor lay awake for a while longer, thinking about her extraordinary dreams. She used to think that everyone had such friends who came to them for years in their dreams. This girl, whose name remained a mystery, had long become an integral part of Eleanor's life, something familiar and natural. But as she grew older, Eleanor realized that her friends had amazing, sometimes fantastical, often incoherent dreams. However, the characters in them constantly changed. No one else had such a long-standing friend from dreams as Eleanor did. "You're just making it all up, simply lying," snapped the sarcastic Brenda with contempt. The other girls were silent, apparently sharing her disbelief. Since then, Eleanor never told anyone about her dreams, not even her parents. For herself, she understood. Such friends in dreams didn't come to other people. What was happening to her was a rarity, something that others obviously found hard to believe. Her parents, at the thought of them, Eleanor smiled. She was incredibly lucky. The girl grew up in an atmosphere of love and complete acceptance, and it had always been that way. Eleanor's mom and dad were older than the parents of her peers. Later, the girl realized that she was a late and very long-awaited child, therefore immensely loved, perhaps even a little spoiled, to be completely honest. There was always plenty in the family, and from a very young age, Eleanor got everything she hinted at. Well, almost everything. Expensive toys, beautiful clothes, trips to the circus and concerts, travels. When it was time to go to school, the girl's uniform was ordered from one of the city's most famous dressmakers. The boring gray pinafore prescribed by the gymnasium charter was transformed by the craftswoman into an elegant, graceful outfit. Her parents, without a doubt, pampered their only daughter. Her grandmothers and grandfathers, uncles and aunts, actively helped them in this. Eleanor was the only child in the entire large family, like in that cartoon about Vova Sidorov. And she, like the boy from the famous poem, was loved and cherished. But apparently, they still raised her correctly. Having everything, Eleanor never showed arrogance. She always had many friends. Moreover, her parents deliberately accustomed the girl to independence and, despite boundless love, made certain demands on Eleanor. Good grades, participation in extracurricular clubs and sections, obedience. And yet, Mom and Dad could never fulfill Eleanor's main dream. From the age of 4, the girl begged them to give her a sister. She dreamed of another girl appearing in the family. She could play with her, talk to her, laugh together, just like with that friend from her dreams. Eleanor would braid her hair and share her toys, teach her everything: how to read, how to dress nicely, how to play. They would go for walks together. Life would become much more joyful and interesting to have someone so close, so dear, right there. Eleanor was even willing to have a brother. Or even better, 2 little brothers or sisters at once. After all, people do have twins. But her parents never made this dream come true. As she grew older, Eleanor understood. It was too late. Mom and Dad were close in age to her friend's grandparents, and they had had Eleanor herself at a rather mature age. Perhaps it didn't just happen that way. Now, from movies and TV shows, the girl knew that sometimes people simply couldn't have children. It seemed her parents had exactly that problem. One day, luck smiled on them. They had a daughter. It seemed the gifts of fate ended there. Eleanor adored her father and was very close to her mother. There was complete mutual understanding in the family. The girl couldn't remember ever being seriously punished. Usually, she shared all her secrets and worries with her parents. And yet, for some reason, she never once told them about the girl from her dreams. Perhaps she was afraid that Mom and Dad would start trying to convince their daughter that it was nothing more than fantasies, or even worse, would get scared and take her to psychologists. No, let that girl remain Eleanor's secret. Eleanor herself, having grown up a little, began to form various theories about the girl from her dreams. Sometimes it seemed to her that the imaginary friend was her unfulfilled dream of a sister. Sometimes she imagined that at night she met her inner self. It was no coincidence that the girl looked like her exact copy. And sometimes she even fantasized about parallel worlds, a transition between which occasionally opened in her dreams, and the girl was precisely from there, from another space-time. In short, Eleanor had many theories and thoughts. Eleanor adjusted her blanket and hugged her soft bear tighter. Yes, at 14 years old, she still liked to sleep with plush toys, and was not at all ashamed of it, unlike many of her peers. Eleanor was in no hurry to grow up. With soft toy animals, she felt cozier, calmer, and more pleasant. And her cat Whiskers was lying right next to her and purring. Simply bliss. Her parents were still awake. They often stayed up late, talking or watching a movie. What harmonious parents she had. And that was wonderful. Eleanor valued the peace and quiet that reigned in their family, because by the age of 14, she had already witnessed the divorces of her friends' parents and even observed the unpleasant quarrels and bickering of other people's fathers and mothers. Fortunately, such things never happened in their cozy home. Now her parents were talking quietly about something. Music from some movie played in the background. Eleanor involuntarily listened. What were they talking about? Maybe they were making plans for the summer? The last quarter was starting. It would fly by quickly. And then, the long-awaited and long summer holidays. They would surely fly to the sea or go somewhere else interesting. Most likely her parents were deciding this very question right now. But deciphering the words, Eleanor understood. They were talking about something else, not about summer vacation. She's still very young, Mom insisted. Judging by her tone, she was arguing with Dad. An unprecedented thing. Usually there was always agreement between her parents. How is she young? Dad objected. She's already a teenager. Exactly. Even worse. Teenagers are emotionally unstable, and growing up is difficult enough as it is. She doesn't need to know anything right now. But she'll find out sooner or later anyway, Dad insisted. They know where we live now. Do you think it will be better if Eleanor finds out the truth from them? From people she doesn't know? That will scare her even more. We'll move, Mom countered. You're being transferred to Moscow, aren't you? We've been thinking about moving to the capital for a long time. This is just the right time. Talk to your boss. Let them speed up your transfer. Martha, our daughter should know the truth, no matter how bitter it is, especially now that they know where we are. Now that they're seeking a meeting. No, Robert, Mom objected heatedly. Not now. Absolutely not now. We'll move this summer. And for now. For now, Eleanor and I are going to my cousin's place in Altai. She's been inviting us for a long time. You can sort everything out here for now. What about school? Dad couldn't calm down. What about school? The last quarter is always short and pointless. Nothing terrible will happen if Eleanor misses this month. I'll arrange leave tomorrow, and we'll leave. Martha, I think we're making a mistake right now. You can't run from the past. It's already catching up to us, treading on our heels. We'll see about that, Mom declared confidently and headed to the bathroom, indicating that the conversation was over. Eleanor lay there, trying to process what she had heard. One thing was clear. They were hiding some truth from her. Something so serious, and perhaps even frightening, that they were willing to take her to her aunt in Altai just so Eleanor wouldn't find out something. But what? The girl understood that asking her parents directly was pointless. They would somehow get out of it, but they wouldn't say anything. They were hiding something from her. And it was both unsettling and interesting. Perhaps even more interesting. The next evening, when Eleanor returned from school and her parents from work, Mom announced the trip to Altai. You look pale, tired, the woman smiled, looking into her daughter's eyes. You need to rest and regain your strength. It's okay. You'll miss a month of school. I've already talked to the teacher. They'll give you your final grades. Yes, you'll stay with your aunt, Dad supported. The nature there is simply breathtaking. Eleanor didn't object. The idea of missing the last quarter appealed to her. A trip instead of boring lessons. What could be better? But the girl really wanted to understand. Why did her parents suddenly need to take her so far from home? Who were they hiding from? Why were they running? What kind of truth were they hiding from her? Eleanor's imagination worked perfectly. She and her mother went to Altai by train. For all 3 days of the journey, the girl came up with theories. Maybe her father's business partners were threatening him, or perhaps her parents had an enemy from the past and were forced to hide. What if she had some troubled older brother? He had grown up, become a bandit, and now for some reason had reappeared. After all, Dad had said that someone had found out where they lived. That was the whole reason for the trip to Altai and the move to the capital. Eleanor decided that now she would deliberately go to sleep late. Maybe she would manage to overhear a conversation between her mother and aunt. They would surely discuss the situation. But the new place gave the girl so many impressions and emotions that she somehow even forgot about her parents' secret. Amazing nature, new friends, even first love. This trip turned out to be very bright and eventful for Eleanor. A string of exciting events pushed the unsettling thoughts out of her head. As always happened at such times, Eleanor stopped meeting that same girl in her dreams. Nothing surprising. Eleanor had long noticed. When her life was full of adventures and emotions, the friend from her dreams temporarily disappeared. But then she always reappeared. Eleanor left her aunt's place almost in tears. She had loved it so much there. The girl had already broken up with her first love. But here, Eleanor had made so many friends. They saw her and her mother off at the station along with her aunt and uncle. The girl never returned to her hometown. She didn't even get to say goodbye to her friends. She and her mother went straight to Moscow, to a new apartment. Over those couple of months, her father had sorted everything out, arranged his work transfer to the capital, found housing, organized the move. Eleanor liked the new place, a spacious apartment, stylish furniture, a luxurious view from the window, and very close by, literally within walking distance, there was so much of interest. Red Square, and a huge zoo, and the Tretyakov Gallery, amusement parks, amazing exhibitions, wonderful cafes and restaurants. It was even great just walking around Moscow. Both during the day and especially in the evening, when lights were everywhere and music could be heard from all around. Summer flew by unnoticed. It was time to go to school. Eleanor was very worried about how she, the new girl, would be received by the class. The day before September 1st, her friend from her dreams finally came to her, for the first time in a long time. She put a comforting arm around Eleanor's shoulders. The girl looked at her with sympathy and a quiet smile, clearly offering support. Eleanor was very happy to see her friend. She had so much to share with her. The girl from the dreams, as always, listened attentively to Eleanor and remained silent. But nevertheless, Eleanor felt the energy of warmth emanating from her, enveloping her, giving her confidence. Everything will be fine for her in the new school. That was what the girl was trying to convey to her. And so it turned out. Eleanor quickly fit into the group, and life went on as usual. It happened on a fine May evening. Eleanor was returning home from classes. She was already finishing her third year at the medical academy. She was one of the most promising students in her faculty, which she was quite proud of. Medicine fascinated her. Finding the cause of a patient's ailment was like a quest. Eleanor had loved intricate puzzles since childhood. Unlike most of her classmates, the girl had already decided on her specialization, cardiology. The mysteries of the heart attracted her. But there was also a personal interest. Her mother. She had recently suffered a heart attack. Eleanor wanted to help her, and other patients like her. The girl paid close attention to the road. She was driving her own car. Her father had given it to her for her 18th birthday. And for almost 2 years now, Eleanor had been cruising in her car instead of shaking her way to and from the university in a crowded bus. The picture was slightly marred by traffic jams, but Eleanor had gotten used to them and took them for granted. The girl liked being a driver. She would put on her favorite music, open the window to let the wind flow through the cabin, and speed down the highway. Beautiful. Eleanor was a very careful driver, always strictly observing traffic rules and keeping an eye on the situation. Driving was enjoyable, but the girl never lost vigilance behind the wheel. That evening, everything was as usual. The impact came from where Eleanor didn't expect it, from the right. The girl, as she should have, was driving through the intersection on a green light. But the driver of an old rusty 10 with loud music blaring from the open windows apparently didn't want to wait his turn. He started moving on red. It was later revealed that the 17-year-old boy, who hadn't even had time to get his license yet, had drunk a lot that evening and had taken his brother's car without asking to impress his girlfriend, to show her what a reckless driver he was. Well, he impressed her. He drove into Eleanor's car at high speed. Nothing happened to him. Strangely enough, only his face was slightly cut by small shards of the windshield. But his passenger was injured. The young girl was taken to the hospital with multiple fractures. Eleanor felt a strong impact. The car spun around. The girl realized she was trapped in a metal vise. The car body had deformed and crumpled from the impact. Eleanor was locked inside. The girl didn't feel pain as such. Shock was at work. But as a future medical professional, she perfectly understood the severity of her injuries. A fractured femur, at least. Her spine, fortunately, seemed intact. But there was a deep lacerated wound on her abdomen. This was the most dangerous. While waiting for rescuers and the ambulance crew, the girl watched as her light-colored t-shirt quickly soaked with blood. She had severe bleeding. Her head was spinning, and spots and blotches flickered before her eyes. People were crowding around. Some young men tried to help her, to extract her from the cabin. They brought tools, unscrewed something. They couldn't do anything. The second car was less damaged. It had flown off to the roadside. Eleanor saw a girl lying unconscious on the asphalt, and nearby, squatting with his face in his hands, the culprit of the accident was rocking back and forth. It was slowly dawning on him what he had done. It seemed Eleanor did lose consciousness for some time. She didn't remember the moment the rescuers arrived, extracted her from the crumpled cabin. She didn't see the doctors who put her in the ambulance. Eleanor came to when she was being wheeled, apparently, into the operating room. The surgeons were ready, masks covering half their faces, now in white coats, caps. The girl's parents were walking quickly beside the gurney, pale, frightened, anxious. Someone had already called them, informed them of what had happened, and they, of course, had rushed there immediately. Eleanor, strangely enough, felt neither pain nor fear. Everything that was happening seemed like a dream. "We'll need blood," Eleanor heard the voice of one of the doctors in white coats right next to her ear. "It's already being brought from the blood bank. The parents didn't match. They both have O positive, and the girl has B negative." Eleanor suddenly realized she was losing consciousness again. Dark spots flickered before her eyes, blurring, turning into blotches. As she sank into oblivion, the girl managed to wonder, how can that be? Mom and Dad have O positive, and she has B negative. That's impossible. Eleanor had studied genetics and knew this for sure. And then the girl somehow found herself immediately at the edge of a dark forest. It was the very beginning of autumn, the girl's favorite time of year. The leaves were just beginning to turn yellow. In the fields spread out before the forest, bright flowers dotted the landscape. Eleanor inhaled the fresh, clean air, filled with the scent of herbs, with pleasure. There could be no doubt. This was one of those dreams. Soon she would appear here, the friend Eleanor had known her whole life. A wonderful dream. And now her support would be very welcome. Indeed, from behind the bushes, a slender girl appeared in a long sundress of an amazing light blue shade. She was smiling, but her eyes held a certain anxiety. As always silently, she walked up to Eleanor. The girls sat down right in the soft grass, leaning their backs against the rough trunk of a tree. Neither spoke a word, but they understood each other perfectly without it. Now the girl from the dream was trying to cheer up her friend, assuring her that everything would be all right. Eleanor understood. She had nothing to worry about. The girl from the dreams was never wrong, and certainly never lied. But the anxiety in her friend's eyes, that was concerning, of course. A hidden sadness. Eleanor had noticed it before. Something was clearly bothering her friend. But she, as usual, remained silent. Eleanor mentally asked the girl how she was doing. She smiled back, waved her hand carelessly, as if she didn't want to upset her. But Eleanor could see, she understood perfectly well, that something was happening to her old friend. And for some reason, they were seeing each other much less often. It was all very strange. Eleanor didn't know how long she had spent at the edge of the forest, sitting in the grass and admiring the fantastically beautiful sunset. Such sunsets didn't exist in the real world. The sky blazed and shimmered with bright red, purple, and deep blue hues. The sight was mesmerizing, calming, relaxing. Then the girlfriend stood up, smiled goodbye, and disappeared. She didn't walk away, didn't hide behind a bush or a turn, but seemed to simply dissolve into the air. Eleanor never managed to catch the moment. It seemed her friend vanished the instant Eleanor blinked her eyes. A fraction of a second was enough for her. So, the wonderful dream would soon end. It had always been this way. And indeed, Eleanor opened her eyes and immediately squeezed them shut again. Bright light, white walls. Oh, if only she could have stayed with her friend from the dreams at the edge of the wonderful forest for just a little longer. It was so good there, so easy. But now Eleanor's whole body ached. She felt nauseous, and her head was spinning badly. There was a nasty taste of medicine in her mouth. A tube stuck out of her vein. An uncomfortable, constricting bandage was on her abdomen. Even breathing was difficult for the girl. Eleanor spent a couple of days in intensive care. She had undergone a serious operation. It turned out she had even been on the verge of life and death. The surgeon later admitted he was afraid he wouldn't be able to save her. But everything worked out. Soon, Eleanor was transferred to a regular ward. She was recovering quickly. Young, healthy body, the doctor explained. In a couple of months, there wouldn't even be any consequences left. This was certainly good news. In the hospital, Eleanor clearly realized that she was very, very lucky. 10 minutes of delay could have cost her life. She had lost enough blood. Just a little more, and that would have been it. Speaking of blood, the girl often thought about what she had heard while losing consciousness there, on the gurney. The doctor said that both her parents had O-positive blood type, and she herself had B-negative. But she could not have inherited such a group and Rh factor from her mother and father. This contradicted all laws of genetics. So what was the matter? For now, the girl decided not to ask her parents unnecessary questions. They were so worried. Her mother and father visited her in the hospital every day, brought treats that she had nowhere to put. Eleanor shared the parcels with her ward mates, and there was still a lot left over. And then Eleanor was discharged. Some more time passed, and the girl returned to her former life. Studies, meeting friends, parties. As the doctor had promised, the consequences of the accident no longer bothered her. Everything was fine. Only one thing changed. Her car, which had been in the accident, was beyond repair. So her father bought his daughter a new car. This time, a small SUV. For safety reasons, he explained his choice. If you had been in that accident in this beast, you would have only gotten off with a slight fright. Eleanor didn't mind. She liked the new car much more than the old one. So stylish, powerful, big. On Eleanor's 20th birthday, when the guests, relatives, and closest friends had gone home, the birthday girl and her mother were washing dishes in the kitchen. It was their long-standing tradition, celebrating Eleanor's birthday with numerous relatives. The girl would gather her friends the following Saturday. But today was a warm family celebration. Some relatives had specifically come to the capital for her anniversary from other cities. After all, She had a wonderful family. The conversation flowed easily and naturally. Mother and daughter discussed the celebration in detail, shared impressions, laughed and joked, made plans. "Tell me about the day you gave birth to me," Eleanor suddenly asked. The question was provocative. The girl wanted to draw her mother into a frank conversation and finally clarify everything for herself. "I'll probably be a mother someday too. I'm interested in everything. How long did it last? What did you feel when you saw me? What was I like in the first minutes after birth?" Her mother hesitated, but quickly composed herself. "Everything happened so quickly and unexpectedly. I don't really remember anything clearly." "I see," Eleanor sighed. She understood that her mother was not being entirely frank with her. How could she forget such an event? And a long-awaited one at that. Her parents often told her how much they dreamed of having a child. But years passed, and they still had no children. They had already despaired, and then, joyful news. Eleanor became a real gift of fate for them, although a little late. Her mother was clearly avoiding the answer now. This only increased Eleanor's suspicions. Perhaps the girl was looking at her mother in a special way. Maybe distrust was readable in her gaze. Because, "No, I can't do this anymore." Her mother suddenly turned off the water and sank heavily onto a chair. "Robert, come here, to the kitchen." Dad entered with a smile on his face. He had just finished vacuuming. Seeing his wife's anxious face, the man immediately became serious. "It's time to tell her everything." The woman looked at her husband. He paled slightly, shivered, and then silently nodded his head and asked his daughter to sit down. Eleanor understood that they were about to tell her that very family secret, the existence of which she had known about for several years. Subconsciously, the girl had guessed what her parents were hiding from her. She understood it when she overheard the doctors talking about blood types. Putting two and two together wasn't difficult. "The thing is," her mother's voice broke, and she looked helplessly at her father. He took the initiative. "Eleanor, you know we love you very, very much," he said. Eleanor nodded. She was sure of that. Few of her acquaintances were surrounded by such love, attention, and care as she was. "You're quite grown up now," her father continued. "And of course, you have the right to know. You see, we see. We adopted you," her mother finished for her husband. Eleanor exhaled loudly. Her ears pounded. She had suspected this was the case, but it was one thing to guess, and another to know the truth. A swarm of questions immediately rushed into her head. Who are my parents? Do you know where they live? Do I have brothers or sisters? Why did they give me up? Her parents exchanged bewildered glances. I just need to know so much. I'm practically bursting with questions. There's a whole bunch of them. But we don't have answers to all of them." Her mother shook her head. "Your biological mother. I only know that she was a very young girl from a troubled family. A child herself. How could she handle a baby? You didn't have any brothers or sisters at that time. What about now? Who knows? We never met your family. We only know about them from the words of the orphanage staff." The man looked at his wife in surprise. Eleanor understood that she was holding something back again. "Mom, please be frank with me this time," the girl asked. "Don't hide anything from me. I'm an adult. I'm ready for any truth. It won't affect my feelings for you in any way. You are my parents. I love you very much." "Well, it wasn't exactly as I just told you," Mom confessed. "I just changed the story a little. There's an unpleasant moment for you in it. It's not particularly significant, actually. But since you want complete honesty, here it is. This family you were born into, they were neighbors of my grandmother. And you could say we bought you from them. I didn't want you to know about it." "Bought," Eleanor repeated. A cold shiver ran down her spine at that word. "What do you mean?" Well, as Mom already said, you were born to a young girl from a troubled family. Dad joined the conversation. She didn't have an abortion in time, and then it was too late. Grandma Martha noticed the young neighbor's belly. Talked to her mother? She said they were going to give the child to an orphanage. And Grandma, she offered to give it, meaning you, to us. All the relatives knew how much we dreamed of a baby. And then such an opportunity presented itself. Your family? They were poor, but healthy, strong, good genes. Taking from an orphanage, you could get a pig in a poke. But they realized that we really needed a child, Mom added to the story. They started bargaining, demanded money. And who would blame them for that? The woman was raising 5 children alone. Your biological mother was the eldest. They were truly very, very needy. We gave them money, enough so they could improve their financial situation. And when you were born, they simply gave you to us. It was difficult afterwards to process the documents for a child obtained this way. But we managed. We sorted everything out. You didn't spend a single day in an orphanage. And where are they now? Eleanor's voice trembled, unexpected tears welling up in her eyes. Unknown, her parents answered in unison. They left afterwards, her mother explained. Something happened there with them. Apparently they went to relatives in another city. I don't know where, and I didn't want to know. Why? Over time, I somehow came to believe that you were mine, got used to the idea. And then, when you became a teenager, they reminded us of themselves. Dad continued. Your grandmother, the mother of the girl who gave birth to you, she showed up at my work. I don't know where she got the address. She said she needed money. She demanded money, threatened to tell you everything. It was a real nightmare. That's why we moved. You and your mother went to Altai, and I sorted out all the moving issues. We were afraid that this woman, that she would somehow harm you. She was in such an aggressive mood. We were scared, to be honest. Very scared, Mom confirmed. Eleanor thought about it. So that was what her father and mother had been talking about many years ago, just before the move, when Eleanor had accidentally overheard them. The girl remembered that night in the smallest detail. That was exactly when she had realized there was some secret in their family. So my blood relatives are impoverished extortionists? More likely, just desperate people, her father shrugged. They had a lot of bad luck in life, and in any case, it has nothing to do with you, her mother smiled at the girl. We raised and brought you up. You are a wonderful person, smart, responsible, kind. You are you. And they are somewhere far away. Don't even think about them. But Eleanor, of course, couldn't help thinking about her unknown relatives. The frank conversation with her parents changed a lot. Now the girl often tried to imagine her biological mother. She knew little about her. She was obviously very young, not much older than Eleanor herself, and most likely still lived in poverty. Eleanor surely had younger brothers and sisters, and definitely 4 of them. After all, her parents had said that her mother was the eldest of 5 children. That was a whole bunch of relatives. Eleanor adored her parents, but she often dreamed of them being younger, like her friends' moms and dads. And the girl had also dreamed of a sister, or brothers, her whole childhood. And now it turned out that she had all of that. What a twist of fate. Eleanor decided for herself that when she was older, she would definitely find her own people. And she absolutely had to see them, find out what they were like, what they looked like, how and where they lived, what they did. It was important. It was very important. The girl didn't get any specific information from her parents. According to them, it seemed that at some point Eleanor's mother's family had moved to another city, and then, many years later, the grandmother suddenly reappeared and demanded money in exchange for silence. The search had to start in the city where Eleanor's childhood had been spent. That was obvious. And she would have to do everything in secret from her parents. The girl saw that her questions caused them pain. They were already quite elderly, and her mother had a bad heart. No, she shouldn't worry them unnecessarily. Eleanor would figure it out herself. She wasn't a child anymore. The girl traveled to her hometown several times. She was looking for a thread that would lead her to her blood relatives. She sifted through the archives of local maternity hospitals and children's clinics, questioned old acquaintances and friends of her parents, having previously arranged with them not to inform her mother and father about her visit. But she didn't learn much. It turned out that she had been registered as a foundling and immediately transferred into the care of the people who found the infant, her father and mother. The real parents of the newborn were, of course, searched for as a matter of procedure, but naturally, they were never found. That was all. Eleanor decided she wouldn't give up. Soon she would graduate from university, get a job, start earning a salary, and then she would have money for detectives. After all, she couldn't manage without professional help. 10 years of Eleanor's life flew by unnoticed from the moment she made the firm decision to find her biological mother. The girl changed a lot. She graduated from university with honors, got a job. Almost immediately, she had a romance with a colleague, a young and promising head of the surgical department, David. It was true love. The young people didn't delay. They had a lively, fun wedding with a crowd of dressed-up guests, a master of ceremonies, decorated cars, and other festive attributes. Eleanor's parents were happy. They had raised their daughter, educated her, and even married her off. Now they could relax and wait for grandchildren. Eleanor and David decided not to rush with children. The girl wanted to establish herself in her profession. She liked being a doctor. She hadn't been mistaken. Cardiology really turned out to be her life's work. But 3 years after the wedding, the family grew. Eleanor and David had wonderful twin daughters. The young parents decided to surprise the grandmothers and grandfathers. They didn't tell them there would be 2 children until the birth. Everyone was so surprised at the discharge, but they were also happy, of course. Eleanor's mother even shed a tear. "What a miracle! I couldn't believe my eyes." David's mother looked at her newborn granddaughters. "Double happiness. No one in our family has ever had twins. It must be this luck came to the family from your side." Eleanor smiled and didn't answer. David's parents weren't aware of her story. Not because the girl was ashamed of it, she just didn't want to involve people in such details unnecessarily. She herself didn't know if there had been twins in her family. Eleanor enjoyed motherhood. It was hard, but the grandmothers and grandfathers actively helped. The girls grew, bringing joy to relatives on both sides. Eleanor's mother, looking at her granddaughters, sometimes couldn't hold back tears. To think, what happiness! I lived to see my grandchildren. But the happiness for the elderly woman was short-lived. Age, a bad heart. One day Eleanor's mother had another heart attack, and this time they couldn't save her. Eleanor took the loss hard. The person who had done so much for her, who had loved her so much, was gone. Eleanor, orphaned, was supported by her husband, in-laws, and friends. The little ones constantly needed their mother and didn't let her fall into apathy. And yet, it was her father who pulled Eleanor out of her stupor. One day she noticed how much Dad had aged and grown thin, and she realized that he needed help and support far more than she did. Since then, Eleanor visited her parents' apartment every day. In the morning, she would put her daughters in the car and drive to her father's. Together they played with the children, reminisced about the past, cooked, cleaned, and looked at photographs. There were many of them, several thick, worn albums. Eleanor was surprised that these pictures hadn't attracted her attention before. After all, they were a living visual history of her family. Here was Mom, still a very young student, so cheerful, carefree. And here was Dad, a young intern, serious, thoughtful, focused. One of Eleanor's daughters was remarkably like her grandfather in this way. The woman sometimes even forgot that they didn't share genes. Often her father would take the little ones and go out into the yard with them. Eleanor would admire from the window how happily they played together. The elderly man literally blossomed next to his granddaughters. They gave him the strength and energy to live on. Eleanor would clean and fuss in the kitchen during this time. Her father wasn't used to managing the household on his own. He said he didn't need much for himself. But his daughter tried very hard, cooking his favorite dishes. True, they weren't as tasty as Mom's, but it was still better than nothing. Over the past decades, so many significant events and changes had occurred in Eleanor's life. Both good, joyful ones, and sad, even tragic ones. It was no wonder that the woman had temporarily put aside the idea of searching for her blood relatives. No, she always remembered it, but she didn't have time for family secrets. So many worries, so many incidents, so many problems that needed to be solved urgently. The friend from her dreams came to Eleanor less and less often. Now she appeared once every 3 or 4 months. And of course, she grew up with Eleanor. They still didn't talk, but they understood each other perfectly without words and were very happy to meet. On a fine May day, Eleanor sat on the sofa in her parents' apartment, legs tucked under her, flipping through an album. Through the open window came the cheerful voices of her daughters. They had started an active game with their grandfather. He was all for it. Her father had told Eleanor more than once that his granddaughters kept him in shape, didn't let him get down. Eleanor smiled, looking at the old pictures. She hadn't seen these before. Black and white, with a decorative border. They were more than half a century old, almost antique. Nevertheless, the photographs still held the smell of printing ink. One of the pictures particularly attracted Eleanor's attention. In it, she noticed her mother at the age of 12 or 13. It was definitely her. Eleanor recognized the large, wide-open eyes, the curly hair, and the mole on her cheek. Eleanor had seen few photos of her mother at that age, so she was now examining this old picture with interest. The girl mother was sitting surrounded by adults, probably her parents and some older relatives. An interesting thought suddenly crossed Eleanor's mind. In the past, people used to sign the back of photographs, indicating the people depicted and other important notes, the year of the picture, the place. The woman took the photograph out of the album, turned it over. Just as she thought. In neat handwriting on the yellowed cardboard, someone had written, left to right, Helen, John, Smith, Zoe, Anne, Martha, Alexievka, 1959, July. Martha was the girl, meaning Eleanor's mother. Anne was her maternal grandmother. Mom had said that she named her only daughter after her beloved grandmother. The woman didn't know the other people. Maybe her parents had told her about these relatives once, but who would have listened carefully back then? And Alexievka, apparently, was the name of the very village where Eleanor was born. That's where her blood relatives once lived. Her parents had said that Eleanor was born to a young neighbor of her mother's grandmother, this same Anne pictured in the photograph. Grandma Anne had helped her granddaughter and her husband become parents. It was no wonder they named their daughter after her. Everything fit. So, Eleanor's small homeland was Alexievka itself. Maybe people who knew her relatives still lived there? Eleanor closed the album with a heavy sigh. Alexievka. That's where she had to start her search. The desire to find her biological mother, which had been dormant for a while, was resurrected with new force. Eleanor realized she couldn't sit idly by anymore. It was time to learn the truth about her relatives, no matter how bitter, how unpleasant it was. It was scary, of course. But how could she live on without knowing her roots? She had to find out about her birth family, if only for the sake of her daughters. At home, Eleanor shared her thoughts with David. Her husband always supported his beloved wife in everything. Of course, he knew her difficult history. "I'm with you," the man simply replied after listening to Eleanor. "When do we leave?" The woman smiled. She hadn't expected any other reaction from David. With him, she wasn't afraid of anything. They would overcome everything. They decided to go the very next weekend. What was the point of waiting? The sooner Eleanor knew the truth, the better. All the preparations were made during the week. David arranged for his parents to take the granddaughters for 2 days. Eleanor found out where Alexeyevka was located and how to get there, and she filled her car's gas tank to the brim. The night before the fateful trip, the woman couldn't fall asleep. Her heart pounded. Her hands and feet felt like cotton. David had been peacefully snoring on his side of the bed for a long time, while she just stared at the ceiling. Eleanor didn't understand herself. What did she want more? To find her birth family in Alexeyevka and meet the people who had once sold her to strangers? Or not to find any trace of her biological mother in this village at all? In the morning, Eleanor and David were already driving along the country highway. The woman was sitting in the passenger seat. In that state, she shouldn't have been driving. Eleanor was so nervous that she shivered periodically. David, seeing his wife's anxiety, tried his best to cheer her up. Fields, meadows, and plantations ran along both sides of the highway. Villages and settlements flashed by from time to time. The couple had left just as dawn was breaking. They reached Alexeyevka closer to lunchtime. The sun was already high in the sky. "Well, here we are." David parked the car near a modest sign with the village name. It was a small settlement with deserted, narrow streets. The houses here were varied. Some very small, crooked, blackened with time, and some solid, quite modern, with satellite dishes under the roofs. "And how do we find the right house?" Eleanor asked in confusion. "There's no harm in asking," David replied casually and confidently walked forward. Eleanor hurried after him. First, they simply walked around the village, looking closely. Eleanor looked around in surprise. She had never been to such a place. Quiet, sparsely populated, calm, even somewhat sleepy. Curious chickens scurried in the road dust, and cautious cats roamed around. Muffled conversations could be heard from some yards. The air was filled with the smells of homemade food, mixed with the aromas of sun-heated herbs. Soon the couple came out onto a spacious clearing, something like a square. And here they finally met people. Several old people were sitting on a bench under a sprawling tall tree, discussing something. Women in brightly colored calico dresses were chatting on the porch of a shop. Little children clung to the hems of 2 of them. A little further away, near a building that looked like a warehouse, a group of children were playing, boys and girls tanned almost black, dirty and barefoot. "Well, here are the locals," David summed up. People noticed the strangers and openly stared at them, glancing secretly, observing propriety. But of course, these glances could not escape Eleanor and David. The children behaved more openly, left their game, and looked at the newcomers with curiosity. Yes, it was clear that Alexeyevka was not often graced with visitors. David walked up to the women on the porch, smiled charmingly, and greeted them. "Hello to you too," one of the ladies replied. "Who have you come here to see?" "Not anyone specific," David began to explain. "We just want to find one house. My wife's great-grandmother's house. Just out of interest." The woman's name was Anne Stepanovna Miller. "Maybe you remember Grandma Anne?" "Grandma Anne?" replied a red-haired woman with bright green eyes. A chubby little boy, also red-haired and covered in freckles, clung tightly to her hand. "Of course we remember. She was good, kind. She absolutely adored us children. She dreamed of great-grandchildren. She didn't have any then. So, you're her great-granddaughter?" The oldest woman in the group was scrutinizing Eleanor with her eyes. The others were younger, maybe 35 to 40 at most. This one could have been a mother to one of them. Yes, I'm her great-granddaughter. I wanted to see where my great-grandmother lived, to learn more about my roots. Eleanor noticed that the women were whispering and looking at her strangely. It was unpleasant. The house is on the 3rd street from here, on Flower Street, number 19, the elderly woman replied. But no one lives there anymore. It's been empty since old Anne died. Your parents couldn't sell it. Who needs to move to our remote village? No fools were found. David and Eleanor thanked the women for the information and moved on. Why were they looking at me like that? Eleanor wondered. Did you notice? They almost drilled holes in us with their eyes. Nothing surprising. A new face and a relative of their fellow villager whom everyone knew. People are just curious. Don't worry about it. But they were whispering about something, Eleanor continued. I heard something like, looks like 2 drops of water, and blood is thicker than water. Who do they think I look like? Not great-grandmother Anne, surely. We don't even have common genes, as it turned out. Well, maybe they don't know that story? David shrugged. So they saw a resemblance. I don't know. I think such an event would have been hard to hide in a village. Most likely people are aware. Perhaps. Then it's even more understandable why they were staring. And here's the house we need. David pointed with his hand at a leaning fence. Behind the time-worn fence stretched an overgrown garden. Weeds, unimpeded by anything, had taken over the entire area. They had even managed to grow on the roof of the time-blackened shed. In the center of this green sea stood a small house. Once, it had probably been painted a bright blue. Now the paint was faded and peeling. The windows were broken. The door hung on one hinge. It was clear that everything inside had long been overgrown with dust and cobwebs. It was surely a paradise for insects and small animals. I don't feel like going in there, Eleanor shook her head. I don't like any of this. Yes, I don't feel like it either, David agreed. He took a few photos of the house and garden, and then added, but we didn't actually come here for this house, right? We need to find information about your relatives. That is, to find the house where they once lived. I understood it was the neighbors across the street, Eleanor said and turned around. My mother told me, when she was explaining, she said, the neighbor's house across from Grandma's. David also turned around. Now they were both looking at another house. It was small, somewhat shabby, but clearly inhabited. Trimmed grass, curtains on the windows, a forgotten book on a bench in the garden, a few neat beds, carrots, onions, peppers. Someone definitely lived here. What do we do? Eleanor asked, looking at David. We'll just knock and ask who lives here. Excellent idea, David approved and moved towards the gate. Eleanor stopped her husband. Maybe it's better to observe for a while. Wait until someone appears in the garden or at the gate, and then approach. It feels a bit awkward otherwise. Whatever you say, David didn't argue. Only we could sit here until evening like this. Who knows? Maybe the people are at work. But Eleanor insisted. Meeting the inhabitants of the house scared her. After all, they could be her relatives. Or on the contrary, people who knew nothing about them. Then the search would hit a dead end. Which option was better? Eleanor didn't have an answer to that question yet. The couple sat down on a sun-warmed boulder by the fence of the abandoned house on Flower Street. Around them stood poor little houses. Many, like Eleanor's great-grandmother's dwelling, were empty and overgrown with weeds. Poverty and desolation. A sad sight. Eleanor tried to imagine this street in the past, when it was still alive and inhabited. Perhaps children's voices rang out here, boys on bicycles darted back and forth, and clotheslines with drying colorful laundry were hung in the yards. Now, this area resembled a ghost town. And yet, someone still remained here. Eleanor didn't know how long she and David had sat there, intently watching the neighbor's house. Perhaps more than an hour had passed. At least the sun was already beginning to set. Her husband seemed to have even dozed off. Eleanor didn't disturb him. She, as always, fantasized, imagining different scenarios for the situation. And for some reason, all of them scared her. She certainly didn't expect what happened next. The door of the little house opposite suddenly quietly opened. A woman in a wheelchair appeared on the porch. She rolled down the homemade wooden ramp from the porch and quickly wheeled towards the bench where the forgotten book lay. Eleanor nudged David with her elbow. He opened his eyes and also stared at the resident of the old house. She had just turned her back to them. It was time to act. The couple got up from their spot and walked towards the fence. "Hello," David called out in the friendliest tone he could muster. Eleanor also greeted her. The woman turned around, looked at the guests with curiosity. Eleanor and David gasped in surprise. The resident of the house made a similar sound. Her eyebrows shot up sharply, her eyes widened. Eleanor grabbed her husband's hand to keep from falling. Unable to believe her eyes, she looked at the woman in the wheelchair, and the woman stared intently at her. "This simply can't be," flashed through Eleanor's mind. It was her friend from her dreams. The very one she had known her whole life. They had grown up and changed together. This was simply incredible. "Finally," David broke the silence. "I don't understand anything at all. You look so alike. Amazing resemblance." The man had expressed himself incorrectly. Eleanor and the woman in the wheelchair didn't just resemble each other, they were exact copies. The same eyes, nose, and lips, slightly wavy light brown hair. Both were slender and tall, and even their tans were of an identical shade. Coffee with milk. "Is that really you?" the woman said, stunned. A joyful sparkle appeared in her eyes. "I don't believe this. Come in, guests." They didn't delay. "Maybe you'd like some tea or water? I have compote in the fridge, too." Eleanor shook her head negatively. She still hadn't regained the power of speech. "Please sit down," the hostess continued to fuss. "You can sit here on the bench, or we can go to the backyard. I have a gazebo there." David led Eleanor to the bench by the wall of the little house and helped her settle down. He sat down beside her. The woman wheeled closer to them and began to look at Eleanor again, this time with a gentle smile on her face. "So this is what you're like. I imagined you exactly like this." "Who are you?" Eleanor looked up at the woman. The warm smile of the house's inhabitant encouraged her, helped her compose herself. "Well, let's introduce ourselves. My name is Mary. I'm your biological sister. We're twins, as you can easily guess from our appearance." "You're just copies of each other," David remarked. "Like clones." "Monozygotic twins are essentially clones." The doctor and Eleanor woke up. "Educational moment," David teased his wife good-naturedly. "Well, now let's figure out your complicated story. That's why we came here, right?" "Yes," Eleanor eagerly said, looking into Mary's eyes. "Tell me everything you know." "My parents, the people who raised me, they hid the truth from me for a long time. And even afterwards, they didn't like to talk about it." "There's nothing unexpected about that," Mary shrugged. "If I were your parents, I'd probably behave the same way. As for me, my grandmother told me everything. Not right away. I was already grown up. Grandma found out she wasn't going to live much longer. She didn't want to take this story with her." Eleanor suddenly did what she had wanted to do for a long time. She took her sister's hand. It was as if both were struck by a charge. The women looked at each other, smiled broadly, and hugged. It felt so natural, so effortless, as if there hadn't been long years of separation. In her sister's embrace, Eleanor felt warm and calm. Mary, apparently, felt the same way. In some incomprehensible way, Eleanor understood her sister's feelings. Perhaps this was that amazing connection between twins. David watched the women and couldn't help but smile. Then he took out his phone and took a few pictures. "For memory," he explained to the twins. "It's a very interesting moment. Indian soap operas can't compete." Both women smiled cheerfully. "By the way, our story really is more interesting than any Indian soap opera," Mary remarked and began her story. Many years ago, a large family lived in this very house. A single mother, Susan, with 5 children. There wasn't enough money to feed such a crowd. The woman worked from morning till night. She was a cleaner on the collective farm, and then also worked as a dishwasher in the local canteen. And she did odd jobs. Sometimes she earned extra money. Sometimes she weeded someone's garden. Sometimes she helped clean a yard. She worked like a squirrel in a wheel, and still the family lived in poverty. Susan's husband had disappeared long ago. He had gone to the capital for work, and that was it. Vanished without a trace. Either something had happened to him, or he had decided to start a new life. The woman didn't rule out the second option either. Whatever the case, she was left completely alone with 5 children on her hands. Her eldest daughter, Stacy, was initially a support for her mother. She looked after her younger brothers and sisters, cleaned the house, even cooked. Any work she did quickly and well. She was a clever girl, handy, and good at housekeeping. Her mother couldn't praise Stacy enough. And then the girl grew up, and something snapped in her. From an obedient, home-loving child, Stacy turned into a prickly, difficult teenager. Grandma told me that Stacy, our mother, started demanding expensive clothes and money for entertainment. And she also insulted her mother for not being able to provide the children with a normal existence. Stacy suddenly wanted a beautiful life. She dreamed of dressing fashionably, going to the city disco, using expensive cosmetics. Of course, a cleaner mother couldn't fulfill the desires of her rapidly growing daughter. Susan hoped that Stacy's behavior was nothing more than a teenage rebellion. She knew that sometimes it was hard for children to grow up, and she hoped that time would pass and her daughter would be the same as before. But the older the girl got, the worse the problem became. Her mother couldn't provide Stacy with a beautiful life. The girl threw a bit of a tantrum and accepted the fact. Yes, she was from a poor family. Her mother didn't even have money for normal food and clothing for the children. And that meant she had to look for other sponsors. That was all. Young, attractive Stacy, of course, found them without difficulty. It was enough to show up at the city disco in a miniskirt once. The teenage girl acquired adult admirers and new friends. Stacy already looked like a grown-up girl, dressed and behaved accordingly. But in essence, she was still just a child who knew nothing of life. Her mother's heart ached with fear and anxiety for her eldest daughter. But she couldn't do anything with Stacy. She didn't respect her at all. Should she tie the girl to a radiator? Susan tried, of course, to influence her wayward child. She scolded her daughter, punished her, even locked her in the house. But she always ran away, found a way to slip out, and towards adventures and a beautiful, fun life. Sometimes Stacy would disappear in the city for days, then show up at home. She smelled of cigarettes, strong perfume. The girl's whole appearance indicated that she had clearly become addicted to drinking. Her mother desperately tried to reason with her wayward child, gave her examples from life, frightened her with possible consequences, told her how cruel people could be. But Stacy only smirked. She lived a fun, free, bright life. Her new friends had money, and they denied the young charmer nothing. Of course, she also had to pay in some sense. But this didn't bother Stacy. The girl began to disappear from home more often. Her absences became longer. And then one day a neighbor, whose children studied in the city, reported that Stacy was living with some man as his wife. Now the girl didn't appear in Alexeyevka at all, only occasionally called to say that she was fine. Meanwhile, Susan was beside herself with worry, sensing something bad in her heart. Stacy was living with an adult man who had come to their city from another country for work. What if he took her daughter far, far away, and she would never see her again? Or something worse would happen. People said that this man drank a lot, and the woman knew nothing else about her young daughter's chosen one. Several months passed, and then one dark February night, there was a knock at the door. Her daughter stood on the threshold, thin, pale, with dark circles under her eyes, and a huge belly that her winter coat no longer buttoned over. It turned out that Stacy's man had returned to his homeland. He already had a family there. He didn't plan to leave his wife or abandon his children. And then there was Stacy, with this pregnancy. He had sent the girl for an abortion. She wasn't against it. But at the hospital, it turned out that it was already too late. She would have to give birth. The future father preferred to return home, to his own. He didn't need all these problems. Stacy went to her mother in Alexeyevka. Where else could she go? She didn't know how to work, and she didn't want to. Life in the city was expensive. Susan, despite the circumstances, was happy about her daughter's return. First thing, she fed her, then hugged her tightly. They even cried together. Times were hard. The family lived hand to mouth. Susan worked tirelessly, but they were paid little, and sometimes wages were delayed altogether. More and more often, the woman thought that they wouldn't be able to afford Stacy's baby, especially since the girl with a small child wouldn't be able to go to work for a long time. And the family was already barely making ends meet. The younger children were even teased at school for their shabby, worn clothes and lack of necessary supplies. The problem solved itself. One evening, a neighbor, elderly Anne Stepanovna, came to visit. As always, she brought treats for the children, hot cabbage pies, some candy, a jar of raspberry jam, and then she started a long and serious conversation with the hostess. Everyone in the village knew that Martha, Anne Stepanovna's granddaughter, couldn't have children. She had been married for a long time, but still no children. She had even been treated somewhere, but it hadn't helped. And they were such a good family, well off. The young people lived in a large apartment. Both spouses had more than decent salaries, and they had a car, and they flew to the sea for vacation every year. They could give their child everything, show them the world, shower them with toys and beautiful clothes. But years passed, and there was still no baby. Susan sighed heavily. They, on the other hand, had plenty of that good thing. Children, that is. Look, another one was coming soon. How could they raise them? What could they feed them? There were more questions than answers. And why was everything in the world arranged so strangely and unfairly? And then Anne Stepanovna laid out her plan. She offered a large sum of money for Stacy's child, who was about to be born. Martha and her husband Robert would adopt the baby. At first, Susan reacted hostilely to the offer. What was this? What kind of barbarity? Anne Stepanovna suggested she calm down and think, not to decide rashly, to discuss it with her daughter. And she left, giving the neighbors time to think. Susan was categorically against the old woman's proposal. But Stacy, it turned out she had overheard her mother's conversation with Anne Stepanovna, and the neighbor's offer interested her greatly. Just think, she persuaded her mother. It will be good for everyone. We'll get rid of an extra mouth to feed. Martha will get the long-awaited child, and we'll get money, which we desperately need right now. Giving away your own flesh and blood to strangers. Susan shook her head doubtfully. How will I live with that afterwards? What's so bad about it? Stacy insisted. We're not giving it to an orphanage where orphans have a hard time. It will live in a rich family. Just imagine. It will have everything it needs for happiness. And what can we give a child? It will cry. Just like my younger siblings, because they're teased at school for patches on their clothes. In the end, Stacy convinced her mother. Susan went to Anne Stepanovna and informed her that they agreed. A few weeks later, Stacy went into labor. Right at home, almost a month earlier than expected. That's why the girl didn't have time to go to the hospital beforehand, as had been agreed. Everything happened quickly. Susan had to deliver the baby. Thankfully, she had given birth to 5 herself and had some idea of what to do. And then everyone got a surprise. It was twins. 2 girls at once. Anne Stepanovna, upon hearing the news, was happy. Even better, she smiled, looking at the 2 crying babies. We'll have 2 children in the family right away. But it soon became clear that one of the girls was not healthy. Martha and Robert came to pick up the children along with a doctor. He examined the babies and delivered his verdict. One infant is simply wonderful, no abnormalities. But the second one, the doctor picked up tiny Mary. This girl has big problems. Most likely she will never be able to move. Everything points to damage to the central nervous system, consequences of premature birth, and possibly the child suffered oxygen deprivation during pregnancy. This happens when the mother leads an unhealthy lifestyle. Stacy lowered her eyes to the floor, and she knew perfectly well what kind of lifestyle she had led during pregnancy. Robert and Martha refused to take the sick girl. They were upset, of course. Martha even cried a little. The couple had already planned to become parents of 2 little ones at once. They had even prepared a room for the twins. But raising a disabled child, they weren't ready for that. So Mary remained in her birth family. Eleanor went to the city. Grandma Susan told me that at first they wanted to give me to an orphanage, Mary recalled. They had even already filled out the documents. Stacy just needed to sign the refusal. Grandma was scared. She didn't think she could handle such a difficult child. There wasn't enough money for the healthy ones, let alone a disabled child who needed medicine and rehabilitation. Stacy was only too happy to give up the child. She didn't need a healthy daughter. And then this. The doctors who examined little Mary all gave unfavorable prognoses. The examination results showed that Mary would most likely be a vegetable who wouldn't walk, talk, or understand much. Susan cried into her pillow at night. It was hard for her to think that her granddaughter had been born like that. She was her own flesh and blood, after all. Doctors urged her to send the girl to an institution for the disabled, explaining that it wouldn't matter to Mary at all where she was. And Susan had almost decided. She was swaddling her granddaughter's listless body, getting her ready for the trip to the institution, and crying. Suddenly, a sad song about an orphan boy surfaced from somewhere deep in her memory. And Susan began to sing it, looking at the helpless little one who was soon to find herself among strangers. The woman's heart was breaking with pity for her granddaughter. But they had no choice. And suddenly Mary looked directly into Susan's eyes. The sounds of the melody clearly captivated the child. The baby's gaze focused, as if filled with meaning. And the girl smiled. It wasn't a reflex muscle contraction, but a genuine smile, directed at a loved one. The girl was clearly reacting to what was happening, and she really liked the song. "You're no vegetable." Grandma gently picked up the newborn, smiling at her. "I won't give you to anyone." And so Mary stayed with the family. The doctors were wrong. The girl's problems turned out not to be so terrible after all. Stacy didn't approve of her mother's action. She had already managed to sign the refusal. But Susan stood her ground. She couldn't give the child to an orphanage, especially since she understood everything. Her intelligence seemed fine. But yes, her legs and arms were quite weak. It would be hard for such a child in strange surroundings. How could she live, knowing that her own flesh and blood was suffering somewhere? Stacy just waved away her mother's arguments, but didn't argue much. She was already starting a new romance. If her mother wanted a toy, let her fuss over it. What did Stacy care? She was being invited to live in the city again. Stacy fluttered off into a new life. She had everything she wanted again: money, friends, drinks, admirers. And Susan raised her younger children and granddaughter, stretching herself to the limit. But she didn't complain about her fate. She had made her own choice. The woman never regretted her decision. Little Mary filled her heart with tenderness and pity. The girl grew up smart and beautiful. But at the appointed time, the baby didn't take her first steps. Her arms were weak too, but at least they worked. But her legs, they didn't move at all. 4 years later, it became clear that Mary would never be able to walk. A foundation for helping sick children raised money for a wheelchair. It was painful for Susan to see the child in such a device. The chair seemed to dispel the illusion that Mary was a normal, healthy girl. It officially made her disabled. But Mary herself was happy with the acquisition. Of course, now she had the ability to move. Time passed. Mary grew up. She even managed to go to school. By that time, the girl was completely accustomed to the wheelchair. In class, Mary turned out to be one of the best students, and she also made many friends. Children loved their classmate for her kind disposition and cheerful, easygoing nature. They found it interesting to be with the well-read Mary. She could come up with so many games and entertainments on the spot. Susan's children grew up and moved away, and she and Mary were left alone. Grandmother and granddaughter lived soul to soul. Sometimes Stacy would appear. Susan noted with bitterness that the dissolute lifestyle was affecting both her daughter's appearance and personality. The girl, once young and beautiful, had turned into an untidy, fading woman with a swollen face and a hoarse smoker's voice. Susan worried about her daughter, afraid that such a life would not lead her to a good end. And so it happened. When Mary was in 6th grade, a tragedy occurred. In the apartment where Stacy was living with another boyfriend at the time, there was a fire. One of the guests fell asleep with a cigarette right on the sofa, and all the drinking companions died in the fire. Apparently they were in such a state that they didn't even notice the fire. Susan later read in the report that none of these people tried to escape. It was a heavy blow for Mary. Yes, she and Stacy had never been particularly close, but the girl knew she had a mother, loved her, and hoped that Stacy would sooner or later come to her senses. But now there was nothing left to hope for. Susan and Mary grieved for a long time, but time passed, and both had to pull themselves together and return to normal life. And then, a new blow. Susan began to notice that she tired quickly. She had completely lost her appetite. The woman lost weight. Neighbors and Mary literally forced her to see a doctor. Susan initially brushed it off, saying she was just overworked, nothing hurt, so there was nothing to worry about. But then she finally yielded to persuasion, especially since her own condition did worry her. It seemed strange, unusual. It turned out to be cancer, like a bolt from the blue. Susan was not afraid for herself, but for her granddaughter. She was still just a child, helpless, a naive teenager. Susan couldn't leave her, absolutely couldn't. The doctor's prognoses were grim. With such a disease, the maximum lifespan was 1 or 2 years. But Susan surprised everyone. She held on until her granddaughter reached adulthood. The woman conscientiously underwent treatment, followed all the doctor's recommendations, and prayed. Mary had no one else but her. Mary helped her grandmother as much as she could. She learned to do everything around the house, knew which pills Susan should take at what time. Grandmother and granddaughter clung to each other, cared for each other, and talked a lot. During this difficult period, Susan told her granddaughter everything. She decided that the girl should know the truth. She didn't want to take these secrets to the grave with her. When I found out I had a twin sister, I was very happy and understood a lot, Mary said, looking directly into Eleanor's eyes. You might think I'm crazy, but from early childhood, a friend, my exact copy, came to me in my dreams. At first she was a little girl, but as I grew, she grew. When Grandma told me about my sister, I realized that it was probably her. After all, there's a connection between twins. Perhaps in our case, it manifested precisely like this, in these dreams. Eleanor looked seriously at her sister. In these dreams, you weren't in a wheelchair and could walk, right? Yes, Mary nodded. And you? Are you saying? Yes, Eleanor nodded. I had those dreams too. Now I understand that we were in touch all the time. It's amazing, like a miracle. I agree, Mary said. Perhaps it can be explained somehow from a scientific point of view. Eleanor shook her head. People just haven't discovered these channels of communication yet. It's all ahead. I waited for those dreams so much, Mary confessed. I dreamed of seeing you again. Me too. But lately, for some reason, you've been appearing less often. Perhaps the connection weakens over time. But now we don't need that channel anymore. Come visit whenever you want. Mary smiled. Girls, I'm listening to you, and I can't believe it's all true. David looked stunned. And this meeting of yours, and now the dreams. Anything can happen in life, Mary smiled. Her face was radiant with happiness. The sisters held hands. So you were completely alone at 18? Eleanor clarified. I can't imagine that. At that age, I was still a child, living with my parents in my childhood room, studying at university. And you, it turns out, were managing entirely on your own? I had to, Mary nodded. Of course, the neighbors helped me a lot. Sometimes uncles and aunts came to visit. But overall, yes, independent life began. It was okay, I managed. Grandma worried about me for nothing. She thought I would be completely lost without her. She was very worried about that. That's why she found your parents in the city one day. She told me about it years later, knowing she didn't have much time left. Susan was very worried about her granddaughter. Mary couldn't walk, couldn't work. At least she had learned to take care of herself and do housework. Disability payments were tiny. There were no relatives nearby. The world was cruel. The girl would be lost. And so one day Susan decided on a desperate step. She found Martha and Robert in the city. The woman reasoned, as she saw it, quite logically. The couple were raising Mary's sister. Not just a sister, but a twin. Perhaps these people would sympathize with Mary's fate, pity her, take her into their family. Back then, many years ago, the doctor had said that Mary would be severely disabled. Martha and Robert were scared. They didn't take the sick child. But in reality, it wasn't so bad. Mary only had trouble with her legs. Susan knew that in the city, such children lived normal, full lives. Maybe Mary could even still be helped. Who knows? Anne Stepanovna was no longer alive. But Susan still got Robert's work address from one of the neighbors, and one morning, saying she was going to the hospital, went straight to him. Grandma didn't tell me the details of that conversation, Mary recalled. She only said that nothing came of it. Robert and Martha categorically refused even to meet me, and then they moved to Moscow altogether. Of course, you can understand them. They would have had to not only take in a disabled girl, but also reveal the truth to you. My parents told me a completely different story, Eleanor said. Apparently, they were demanding money for their silence, threatening to tell me who I really was. That's very unlike Grandma Susan, Mary shook her head. But I can assume she was desperate, and that's why she talked to your parents that way. She had to ensure my future no matter what. Maybe she went too far. It's a shame Mom and Dad were scared back then. Eleanor frowned slightly. They are actually very kind and attentive, and caring. And they probably feared my reaction to the truth. They were protecting me. Because of that, we lost so much time together. We'll make up for it now, Mary smiled. You'll come visit me, won't you? We'll communicate in reality now, not just in dreams. In connection with that, I have an idea. David intervened in the conversation. Mary, have you ever thought about moving to the city? No, the woman replied. Where would I live there? Suppose there's housing. Would you move? There's housing, Eleanor eagerly said. David, you mean… Yes, my grandmother's apartment, David explained. She can't live alone anymore, and she doesn't want to move in with my parents. She needs someone who will give her medicine on time, cook for her. We haven't been able to find a caregiver. She doesn't like anyone. She says they're strangers. She's afraid of them. And you are as much one of us as can be. What do you think about this? Can you handle it? We'll pay you a good salary. Say yes, Eleanor urged. David's grandmother lives in the next building. She's very sweet, and you'll get along. And she definitely won't be afraid of you when she finds out you're my biological sister. What's there to think about? Nothing keeps me here at all. Of course I agree. Great, David smiled. Eleanor hugged her sister without a word. It was a warm August evening. An unusual group, attracting everyone's attention, moved along the wide street. Two completely identical young, beautiful women in stylish sky blue sundresses, one of them in a wheelchair, and two identical little girls in bright dresses. The little ones were animatedly talking to both women. The sisters held ice cream cones. And I kept wondering where I suddenly got twins. Eleanor chuckled. It turns out I'm a twin myself. I look at my beloved nieces and think that you and I could have been just as happy in childhood, Mary said. I missed you very much. And I missed you. But the main thing is, everything is good now. Everything was indeed good now.